Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. On today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Greg Oliver. Greg is the president and founder of the Canadian Secular Alliance, a nonpartisan and registered not-for-profit organization whose objective is to promote the separation of religion and state in Canada. The CSA has intervened in court cases at the Supreme Court of Canada and successfully led a campaign to repeal blasphemy from the Canadian Criminal Code. Today, Greg and I discuss an egregious violation of secular principles in Canada, the fact that 3 provinces fully fund a separate school system for a single faith, Catholicism. Greg explains why Catholic schools are funded, how 2 provinces stopped funding sectarian schools, addresses many myths about the separate school system, and finally, what we can do about it. It's with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Greg Oliver. Greg Oliver, I'm looking forward to our conversation today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Likewise.
So this has been it's kind of a hobby horse of yours and of the Canadian Secular Alliance for some time. I mean, the Secular Alliance, the Canadian Secular Alliance is committed to government neutrality in matters of religion, right? Government should neither support nor suppress religious expression, right?
Yeah, fundamentally, if we are going to live in a liberal democracy and we value political equality, we should have a government that doesn't favor one group over the other and doesn't favor religion over non-religion or vice versa.
Right. And this is a principle that I fully endorse. In fact, I've been a member of the Canadian Secular Alliance since its founding and have been a policy advisor for most of that time. So I think it's done some great work. But what I want to talk to you about today is one of the key issues. There's been several issues that the Secular Alliance has addressed over the course of its existence. But one issue is the government funding of the separate school systems in Canada. And we're going to focus today on Ontario because it's the most populous province and it's where we both live and it has the greatest subsidies. But before we get to that, a lot of our listeners are not in Ontario or not even in Canada. So can you describe the public and separate school systems that several provinces has, as well as why we have a public and a separate school system in this country?
Well, currently there's 3 provinces, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, that have full funding for Catholic schools. So everybody pays taxes to them, and anybody who's Catholic has a special privilege to go to one of these schools. The reason we have it is rooted in our history. Canada, I guess you could say that the formation of the country in its current political entity, I would say has roots going back to the 7 Years' War and the conquest of Quebec by the British Empire. So the Quebecois were integrated as a British colony, and the Brits, who didn't recognize political equality for Catholics in their own country, did so in Quebec as kind of a pragmatic matter to keep the peace. And ultimately, in the American Revolution, it kept them out of the war. So in the early to mid 1800s, Ontario really began to get populated first with a lot of United Empire loyalists and then a lot of immigrants from Europe. And there was a substantial Catholic minority. And the context of that time was fundamentally different than right now. Like I said, in the UK, Catholics didn't get political equality until 1829. So the idea that Catholics would have full rights when being governed by a Protestant entity was, far from certain. It was a cause of great anxiety. There was a lot more hostility between Catholics and Protestants than there is now. So the first Catholic school opened in Ontario in 1826, and then it was essentially integrated into the government in 1841. The idea was essentially that Catholics felt it was essential to have their own school system so that they could be protected from the Protestant majority.
Right, because although there was the public school system, and that's what it was called, it would be fair at the time to describe it as a Protestant school system. It wasn't neutral, right?
Absolutely. This was not something actually that the government between 1841 and 1867, Upper and Lower Canada, which are Ontario and Quebec today, respectively, were a single entity called the Province of Canada. And the local English Protestants in Ontario didn't want Catholic schools. Kind of the framework that was most relevant for setting up Catholic schools was the 1863 Scott Act. That kind of was the modern day framework for the way that Catholic schools would be represented in the Ontario government. And this was put up to vote, and in Upper Canada, it was actually voted down by 21 to 31. But in Quebec, understandably so, this was much more of a concern and source of anxiety, and the Scott Act was voted in by Lower Canada politicians by a margin of 55 to 10. So it's no exaggeration to say that the only reason that Catholic schools even existed in Ontario in the first place was because of anxiety over Protestant-Catholic relations in Quebec specifically.
So one reason that I keep hearing again and again that we're just stuck with Catholic schools, or we have to have them, or we have to support them, is that it's in our Constitution. So, bring us ahead to 1867, the time of Confederation, and why it wasn't just the Scott Act, but it actually was incorporated into the British North America Act, which was essentially the founding document of Canada as in its current form as a nation state.
Yeah, so in the 1860s, there was a lot of discussion about creating a Dominion of Canada, a kind of new nation state. And in the discussions, there were compromises that had to be made. And the delegates from Quebec en masse essentially made it very clear that they wanted to maintain the existing denominational schools in their provinces. So it was considered a grand bargain at the time, and this is one way that we can integrate these two, French Catholic on one side, English Protestant on the other, and we can have one union, and this would be a way of preserving minority rights.
So what is actually in the Constitution? What is guaranteed in the British North America Act, and then later renamed the Constitution Act?
That's right. So it's Section 93 of the Constitution Act is essentially, without getting into the legalese of it, it guarantees that at the time a province enters confederation, it can keep the existing denominational schools that it has.
Okay, so you used a key word there, and I just want to focus in on that. You said the word can keep. Can. Is it that they are allowed to have denominational schools, or that provinces must keep the denominational schools?
No. So right after Manitoba entered Confederation in 1890, they disposed of their denominational schools. And then later on in history, in the late 1990s, Quebec and Newfoundland got rid of theirs. It was essentially a political decision in both cases. So there's no obligation to keep the old denominational schools. It's just that you are allowed to give a special privilege to these denominations that existed at the time of Confederation. So Saskatchewan and Alberta entered Confederation in 1905. Both had denominational schools, predominantly Catholic, and they exist today as a result of Section 93.
So what provinces, what's the current status of the funding of denominational schools in Canada? Can you just give us we've got 10 provinces, 3 territories. What provinces have denominational schools publicly funded, and which ones don't, and to which extent? To what extent? Because that might vary between provinces as well.
So Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have full funding for Catholic schools. Quebec and Newfoundland and Manitoba had denominational schools at the time they entered Confederation, but have since disposed of them in favor of a single secular system. And the other provinces never had denominational schools. So we're down to 3 out of 10 provinces still have this kind of relic of the time of Confederation.
All right, so tell me a bit more about the process by which Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador got rid of the public funding of their denominational schools, because an objection that I hear whenever this topic comes up from defenders of the Catholic school system, particularly in Ontario, is that, well, it's a constitutional obligation. There's nothing we can do. So we're not going to amend the Constitution. So we're just going to, we're stuck with it. Like it or lump it. We've got to, there's nothing we can do about it. But that's evidently not true. So tell me why that argument isn't valid, and use those 3 provinces as an example.
Well, okay, by far the most important one here is Quebec, because like I said before, they're really the sole, more or less, they were the main reason that the schools existed in the first place. And for years and, well, decades, over a century, Quebec was the most religious province in the country. But since about the 1960s or so, it's flipped, and it's now the least religious. Well, in 1997, it became pretty unpopular. So there was actually, the government at the time put it up to the vote, and it was a unanimous decision by the National Assembly to dispose of it. So they went to the federal government and they said, we want to make an addition to the Section 93 of the Constitution Act. And so they added Section 93A, which is, this does not apply to Quebec. So since 1997, Quebec schools have been, there's one for each language, and they're both secular. There's an English, French, and a secular English and a secular French school system. In the case of Newfoundland, that was put up to a referendum. Well, there were actually 2, but the more relevant one being one in 1997. They actually had 5 denominational school systems. So it was just a huge mess in terms of logistics and wasted money on duplication costs. And ultimately, the people voted 73% in favor of going to one secular school system. So that was actually, they did not go the route of altering the Constitution Act. They altered the Newfoundland Act, which in 1949 was the kind of document that they used to get into Confederation. And they did it that way. And the federal government ratified it the next year. So starting in 1998, they've been a one school system. So it goes without saying, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, if the political will existed, would be free to do the same thing.
All right. Well, then why would they want to? I mean, when people look at Canada in general, we're a wealthy, well-educated nation. In Ontario, anyway, about a third of people that graduate from high school have come through the separate school system, through Catholic high schools, and elementary. And I haven't heard many people complain that people that graduate from Catholic high schools received an inferior education to people that went through the secular system, through the public system. So, why is it so important to you, Greg, and to the Canadian Secular Alliance that we amalgamate the separate and public school systems in Canada?
Well, it goes back to our mandate. I mean, ultimately, it boils down to equality rights. You shouldn't have one privilege that exists for one group of people that nobody else has access to.
So what are those? What are those privileges? I mean, everybody. It's not as though Catholics get a high school education that's funded by the government, and non-Catholics don't get a high school education. Everyone's getting a high school education. So where's the privilege that you're objecting to?
Yeah, so I mean, using that kind of train of thought, like imagine we had two sets of fire departments. So you had the Catholic fire system, and you had the secular fire system. And yeah, it's true that if you were a non-Catholic and your house caught on fire, you'd still have a fire department that would show up at your house. But then, like, would it be fair that, like, your Catholic neighbor, under the same circumstances, could decide whether they wanted to call the Catholic fire department or the secular fire department? I mean, ultimately, it's just, this is it is an advantage we're conferring on one group of people that we're not to another. There may be a variety of reasons why a local, if you had a local Catholic school that had it was much closer to your house, for example, like, I think it's pretty unfair that someone would be ineligible based on the religion of their parents.
Right. So particularly in rural Ontario, you might get a young child who's bused past the Catholic school next door to the nearest public school that might be 45 minutes or even an hour away each way.
Yeah, and there could be a myriad of other reasons that one, may prefer one school over another. Mm-hmm. Everybody's different. The idea, though, that you'd restrict access in most cases to 1/3 of the population, I think, is a little, it's against the spirit of equality rights and a liberal democracy. And now, if it were the case that Catholics were an endangered minority, where there was like a real onus on the state to give them extra protection or a leg up, that would be one thing. And perhaps that was the case in 1867. It's certainly not the case in 2024. Catholics do just as well as everybody else. The idea of anti-Catholic bigotry is like, it's pretty archaic. It's kind of a bigotry of a bygone era, in my opinion. So the idea that the state would need to provide a special service, I think, is a bit absurd. And then, of course, there's like other reasons like that. It's just a big waste of money too.
All right, so let's get into some of these other reasons. So I've heard arguments that that it's not a waste of money, that it's the funding is per pupil. And in fact, we were talking earlier, back in, I think it was 2018, the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association published a document that gave a list of several reasons why why Ontario specifically should not amalgamate the separate and the public school boards. And the first one is exactly that. They said that amalgamation will not produce any significant savings. They point to when cities amalgamate, when companies merge, that there's often promised savings. They are rarely, if ever, realized. And the other argument that they used in that sense is that the funding for schools is on a per student basis. Even if you amalgamate the schools, you're going to have the same number of students attending public schools from JK up to grade 12 in the province. So there's not going to be any savings. So let's look just at the financial aspect of things. Why do you think that there's going to be significant financial savings from amalgamating the public and Catholic school systems in the province?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, that per pupil talking point is pretty inaccurate. There's a lot of funding grants. If you want to go to the Ministry of Education's website and download the technical paper they have published annually, you can see the exact formula. There are a multitude of different funding grants, and some of them, the largest one is per pupil. But there are several that are also based on geographical dispersion. There's like ones for special education, French education, all sorts of stuff like that. So when people make that point, that's pretty dishonest. I think what we have to look at here is really look at it from a bird's eye view. In Ontario, we have 4 school systems. We have Catholic English and French, public English and French. Mm-hmm. Now, does it cost more to run 4 school systems or 2 school systems? Now, break it down a little further. Typically, Catholic, we'll just focus on the English for a second. Typically, the Catholic and public English school systems, the school boards are what's called coterminous. That means they share the same geographic boundaries. So essentially you can have one administration. You don't have to change the borders. You just integrate the 2 school boards into one. That is going to require less administration. Another big one is transportation. If you have a school in your town that is Catholic, but to go to a public school, you have to take a bus for a half hour to the neighboring town. Well, under a single school system for each language, you can just attend the school that's actually in your town. So there's less busing requirements. This is especially relevant in rural areas. Mm-hmm. And then another major one, actually the biggest dollar amount, is just underutilized buildings. In 2014, there was over 600 schools at less than half of capacity. I found one pair of schools. One was a English public elementary school, and there was a Catholic counterpart immediately across the street, and both were less than half full. So there's an obvious case where you could just minimal disruption. You don't even have to change the bus routes, right? You take the students from one school and you put them in the other building, and then the other building is available for whatever reason. There's all sorts of purposes that you could use with, a school that is like a property like that. You can rent it out as an office. You can develop it into housing. There's all sorts of purposes that it could be applied to. So those are kind of like the big 3 sources of savings right there: is underutilized properties, duplicate transportation, and duplicate administration.
Okay. Another strong argument against amalgamation is the upheaval that it would cause when you're for students, for parents, for communities, and I would like to know your thoughts on that, and if you can draw on the experience of Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. Did they recognize those financial savings that you just mentioned? Because I imagine that those would be similar in those provinces when they moved. And was it a tremendous upheaval when those 2 provinces moved from one separate school system to a public one, and even more so in Newfoundland and Labrador when there were several separate school systems that got amalgamated into a single public school system?
Well, it goes without saying, any change, any government policy is going to have some degree of disruption. But ultimately, they got through it. There was when we got rid of grade 13 many years ago in Ontario, there was disruption to the people who were affected. It's inevitable. There could be some transition costs. But like ultimately, that if we're looking towards building a better future, it's not like these effects are so onerous that we cannot burden it. It's in terms of like transferring schools and things like that. These are all things that have to be negotiated. Perhaps you could have a situation where students did not have to switch to the closer school. They could stay at their existing school for the duration of their education. These are all things that would have to be negotiated by the stakeholders if it were agreed upon that amalgamation was the long-term vision for the province.
All right. There's another argument. This is again drawing from the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association. Is that, and I'll quote: "Today's Catholic schools are effective, modern, and inclusive." And I want to address this one myself. I want to draw people's attention to a conversation I had with Tanya Callahan last year on Podcast for Inquiry. I recommend that you listen to that episode based on her book, Homophobia in the Hallways. And it really addresses some of the discrimination and bigotry that is present even today in the Catholic school systems in Canada. But one quotation or one line that they have in there, and I'm going to quote that as well: "Catholic students are free to form their own gay-straight alliances, something Catholic teachers have long supported." Now, this is a true statement, but the reason that it is true is that Catholic administrators, the principals and people higher up, had banned students, had forbidden students from forming gay-straight alliances for so many years that the Ontario government had to pass a law that stated that if students wanted to form a gay-straight alliance, they couldn't be forbidden from doing so. Even though some individual Catholic teachers were supportive, the administration was steadfast against it. And when that law was being proposed and debated, the Catholic hierarchy, the bishops, the Archbishop of Toronto, wrote a very disingenuous but also scathing letter criticizing the Ontario government for singling out the poor Catholics who were simply trying to exercise their faith, and it was. It really was self-victimizing. Like, why are we being singled out? Sort of ignoring the fact that the Catholic faith is the only one that gets a fully funded school system, except of course for the publicly funded one. And so this was back in 2012, and then to come back, 4 or 5 years later and say, well, we're very open, warm, and inclusive, I think is a little bit of selective memory. And I want to draw people's attention to the fact that that to the extent that Catholic schools are open and inclusive, it's because they have been forced to and dragged that way, kicking and screaming against their will to that point that they are now so very proud of. Is there so sorry to go on a bit of a monologue. If you want to add to that in any way, please feel free.
Well, I think that, one of the other, really should have mentioned this earlier, to me, one of the other major problems with this system is that the Catholic schools have what's called charter immunity. So what does that mean? Because their protection in Section 93 predates Canada's adoption of a modern liberal democratic constitution in 1982 that guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on. They have the legal right to discriminate and people who challenge it on the basis that it's a violation of the charter are subject to potentially having their case thrown out because the charter does not apply to Catholic schools. And there have been several cases of Catholic schools having their right upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada for their right to discriminate. In particular, this has been relevant to discriminating against teachers. So there's been teachers have been fired for marrying non-Catholics, for getting pregnant out of wedlock, for getting married in a civil ceremony even. I spoke to one, and these were all challenged, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, sorry, but the Catholic schools have their right to determine what is Catholic and what is non-Catholic, and it's at their judgment. And so they have the legal right to be as discriminatory as they please, provided it's within the domain that's protected by Section 93. Now, in terms of what is the modern standard of Catholicism in Catholic schools, yeah, of course it's improved a lot. I mean, the average Catholic in Ontario is not some zealot. They're favor gay rights and they're on board with the liberal democratic project. There are some people, a minority, who are disproportionately represented in trustee boards across the province who still hold to maybe a more socially conservative view of Catholicism.
Right, like raising the rainbow flag or the trans rights flag at the York District School Board, or banning displays of the rainbow flag and within schools.
Yeah, like in 2002, there was a Mark Hall case. So Mark Hall was a Catholic student, and he brought his boyfriend to the prom. And surely enough, they told him that was not permitted. Mm-hmm. A court case ensued, and then ultimately they backed down, let him go, because they're a substantial chunk of people who run the Catholic schools are aware that their position is on shaky ground, and they really ought to not rock the boat on more egregious violations. But it still happens. So you said gay-straight alliances. Well, I was at a meeting, and there was a motion in 2014 at the Toronto Catholic District School Board to ban gay-straight alliances in defiance of the government bill. And I witnessed with my own eyes that there were roughly 1/3 of the trustees were like, they can't tell us what to do. They can't tell us what's Catholic. This is not Catholic. Promoting homosexuality or even tolerating it is not in our religious worldview. We should fight this. We should fight the government and refuse to allow gay-straight alliances. And roughly 1/3 of the trustees had the exact opposite opinion. They were in no way, shape, or form homophobic and totally supported gay-straight alliances. And then roughly 1/3 said, well, yeah, we really shouldn't have them, but, we don't want to, let's pick our hill to die on. This is not what we want to lose Catholic schools over. So I think that's part of the consideration that's going on in the Catholic school leadership at the moment. There's another recent case that was quite awful. The Toronto Catholic District School Board in 2019, there was a guy, he's still a trustee today, a guy by the name of Michael Del Grande. They were voting on a code of conduct, and they wanted to add the words gender identity and gender expression to the code of conduct, essentially saying that we cannot discriminate on these two characteristics. And he proposed adding other protected classes, including pedophilia, bestiality, and cannibalism. So, needless to say, this caused an uproar. Half of the people on the trustee board were mortified, but they voted on whether to keep him on the board, and ultimately voted that he didn't breach the trustee code of conduct with his statements. So, it's out there. I think it's a bit of a ticking time bomb. At some point, I think there will be some trustees who still cling on to these old world views, and I think that's going to rear its ugly head again at some point.
All right, let's talk one more reason not to mess with the Catholic school system, and I want your opinion on it, because this one actually resonates with me, and that is essentially there are bigger fish to fry. We've got major problems with the school system where students are still recovering from almost 2 years of lockdown of COVID. We have a multi-billion-dollar backlog of school repairs to do to keep our school buildings in top operational form. There's problems with the teacher recruitment and keeping teachers. There are a lot of major issues with our school systems today, and is talking about amalgamation of the public and separate school systems important enough? Whatever the merits of that we've spoken of already, are they important enough to come to the top of the list, given everything else that needs to happen in order to ensure that the next generation gets the best education possible?
So that's obviously a matter of personal judgment. There's always going to be something that, at least to some group of people, is more important than whatever you think needs to get done. I don't think that's a very good reason not to do it. The thing is we talk about the amount of waste and how much would be saved by amalgamating is, I guess, a highly contentious and debatable proposition. But we're looking at, likely $1 billion or $2 billion, something like that. And at some point, we're gonna especially when the baby boomers get geriatric and healthcare costs explode, we're gonna have to ask ourselves, where's our priority with our dollars? And now there's a variety of views. I mean, you would have fiscal conservatives who just want, bring the deficit lower or potentially have tax cuts. And then you have people who would want to expand social services so that geriatric baby boomers had great medical care. Whatever your political priority is, compare maintaining the status quo and the cost of that, not just financial cost, but the cost of having an unequal system and all that, whatever value you place on that in comparison to the priorities that you do have, because we do have a limited amount of resources. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just of the view that if it's worth doing, it's worth doing.
Okay, well, the topic has been broached before. It's not as though this is the first time anyone has mentioned that. And I'd like you to talk about a man called John Tory. And some people may know him as the former mayor of Toronto, but I'd like you to talk about John Tory from when he was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. And there was something that happened on the third or fourth day of an election campaign that people still point to today when they say that they're not, when politicians still point to that today, whenever this topic comes up. So can you spread a little, can you inform our listeners about what he said and what the reaction was, and why politicians still think of that today whenever anybody mentions the Catholic school system in Ontario?
So I do remember this well, because that specific event is what aroused my interest in this particular issue. So John Tory, at the beginning of the campaign he was running for premier, was actually polling in the lead above Dalton McGuinty's Liberals. And he acknowledged that there was an unfairness and that Catholics got a privilege that nobody else did. So he came up with a proposal to address it. The proposal was to extend full public funding to all denominational schools, equally. What happened was, first of all, my opinion of that is, it does address the inequality issue. it is a ridiculous solution because obviously, if we're talking about duplication costs, they would explode. And it boils down to the idea that this is one of the critiques I have of the Catholic school system. I don't think it's a good idea that we separate our children based on the religious worldviews of their parents. So this would magnify that negative effect of the system. You talk about the logistics. I mean, I'm sure it would have been what would the transition cost been on an enterprise like that? So anyway, Ontarians overwhelmingly rejected it. And Tory, you not only lost the election, Dalton McGuinty and the Liberals won a majority, and John Tory lost his seat in that election. So it was a fundamentally different proposal than amalgamating the two systems so that we have a secular system for each official language. But it's often noted by proponents of the status quo that, we already had this discussion and Ontario overwhelmingly rejected it, which is not the least bit true.
But nonetheless, that's the lesson that many politicians drew, is like, it's political suicide to touch this, so we're just not going to change anything regarding the education system.
Yeah, I don't think that people who know a little more really buy that too much. People who are like pretty sharp on politics, they acknowledge that it's not one and the same. I've had the ability to talk to a lot of politicians over the years about this issue, sometimes formally in a meeting, sometimes just informally in some other setting. And I think that the primary problem here politically is, even though you look at polls, and polls consistently show Ontarians have like roughly 70%, give or take, support for one school system. The perception is that, sure, the 70% may support it, but the passion about it is not super, super high. It's not front of mind when they think of the issues that really stir them up politically.
Right.
There's exceptions.
Those supported, they're not going to choose their party based on their support of the public schools, of a single publicly funded school system.
Yeah, there are some people like me and you who rouses maybe a little more than the average person. And the only party in the 2007 election that had one school system as part of their platform was the Green Party. And in the 2007 election, they saw their percentage of the vote go from 3% to 7%. So of those 70%, maybe 4% were like motivated by the policy proposal enough to really be motivated to do something about it. But on the other side, the 30%, they would like to keep it. I think the perception is that of those 30%, let's say 10% would be rabid supporters of maintaining the status quo. Like, it's very important to them, and that the noise they would create would offset any gains from basically doing something that the 70% would prefer to see done. So ultimately, they view it as a net loser in terms of voting. So that perception has to change. I think that's kind of the main obstacle politically.
Okay, well, there have been other efforts to stop the public funding of the separate school system. In fact, the Secular Alliance consulted on a lawsuit that went through the courts recently. Can you talk about what the goal was, what the argument was, and what the result was?
So I think it was 2011, there's a lady by the name of Rita Landau who brought a case against the government trying to challenge the constitutionality of Catholic schools in Ontario. And, she had some supporters like the CCLA, and she was trained she went to law school, but she was never a practicing lawyer throughout her career. And ultimately the judge didn't give her standing, which means like they don't think that she was a big enough stakeholder to be making that case. But
So not based on the merits, but if anyone is going to be, there only a certain number of people can bring this type of lawsuit, and she's not one of them.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So in the aftermath of that, Riva, in combination with the Canadian Secular Alliance and another organization called CRIPE, which is Civil Rights and Public Education, that has been on this issue since the 1980s, actually, kind of mostly of school teachers, got together and we found a couple plaintiffs. One was a parent of kids who had to bus his kids far away to go to school when there was a Catholic school right near him that would have demonstrably created hardship for him and his children, having to travel that kind of distance that wouldn't have existed if there was one school system. And then the other was a teacher from Hamilton, and she was a non-Catholic graduate of Teachers College who was hoping to gain employment in the industry, but she couldn't get hired for 10 years. Or I might have the exact date wrong. One of the other major problems with the Catholic school system is because they have this right to discriminate. If you want to enter the teacher profession, the best thing you can do to increase your probability of employment is to convert to Catholicism. Because if you're a Catholic, you have access to 1/3 of the jobs in the Catholic school system, and you have all the jobs in the public school system. And in the public school system, it would be illegal to discriminate against you based on religion. But the opposite is true if you're a non-Catholic. So you only have access to 2/3 of the jobs.
Right.
So in her case, she had a real grievance about, being underemployed as a result of this policy. So the coalition is called OPEN. One Public Education Now is the acronym. So we basically started a charter challenge to the public school system. We got, we done a ton of research, got lawyers, and we came up with a case that challenged specifically the right, the constitutionality of providing Catholic schools to high school, because at the time of Confederation, they only gave education up to what most generously could be determined to be at a grade 9 or 10 level. So for years and years and years until the 1980s, Catholic schools were only available for elementary school. So we were challenging that. And the other aspect of our challenge was the constitutionality of funding non-Catholics at Catholic schools. So right now, Catholic schools can, for elementary school, they have the right to do whatever they want. So the Toronto Catholic District School Board requires a baptismal certificate from a Catholic school board, but in other Catholic schools around the province, it's up to them. If they want to have you, they'll have you. If you're non-Catholic, if they don't want to have you, it's fine.
So if they're fully subscribed, if the school is full, they'll only let in Catholic students and they'll discriminate against non-Catholic students. But if the school is empty or if the school is half full, they'll take anyone that wants to come in, Catholic or not.
Yeah, so in some jurisdictions, there's fights over students. Catholic schools actively try to get non-Catholics to attend their school to get better funding.
They have the right to discriminate, but they don't always do so in practice.
That's right.
Okay.
So we were disputing that because the 1863 Scott Act that got grandfathered in at the time of Confederation explicitly stated that non-Catholics were not allowed to attend Catholic school.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, and there was a similar case in Saskatchewan that was successful at the first level of it being heard. There was a case challenging the constitutionality of non-Catholics at Catholic schools. And the judge ruled in favor of the proposition that it was unconstitutional, and it went to the top court in Saskatchewan and was shot down. We were hoping it would go to the Supreme Court of Canada, but unfortunately they never took the case. So
they lodged an appeal, but the Supreme Court declined to hear it.
That's right.
Okay, that does happen. Surprising that on this topic, because it's seems to be a piece of jurisdiction that is calling out for a Supreme Court judgment, but I guess that's their right.
So yeah, we did a lot of freedom of information requests, and like pretty much every school board in Ontario. And if you look at the numbers, we were querying what percentage of students are non-Catholics at a lot of these schools, and a lot of school boards were not very cooperative, and some of them didn't take statistics on the matter because they were not legal. They didn't feel they were legally obliged to. But of the boards that did report, a lot of them had like 20-30% non-Catholics at their schools. In some more rural cases, we found ones like slightly above 50% non-Catholics. So
that just goes to show how open and inclusive Catholic schools are, and how misguided your campaign is, Mr. Oliver.
Well, okay, sure. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why somebody might want to go to a Catholic school. I mean, I had a friend telling me that he wanted his daughters to go to a Catholic school because where he grew up, all the Catholic schools had the best sports teams in his city. There was, there's a perception among some people that having a religion in a school, even if it's not your own, is more a better environment for discipline.
Okay. So what was the result of this court case, the one that you and Open filed?
Well, unfortunately, we got to a stage where there was legal, we learned a lot about the legal process. It's very slow moving and expensive. And we got to a stage where there was a motion to strike for our challenge that we submitted. And then unfortunately it was successful, and we ran out of money. So it remains unresolved in my opinion. Not a lawyer, but I think both of those, based on our research, I stand by the idea that both funding for high school and funding for non-Catholics were not part of the grand bargain. They were not part of what was grandfathered in at Confederation. But unfortunately, we'll have to wait to see that adjudicated. It never has been.
Right. And last year, the Centre for Inquiry Canada, the Canadian Secular Alliance, Humanist Canada, and many other secular organizations that operate in the province of Ontario circulated a petition calling for the cessation of public funding for the separate school system. Got several thousand signatures. It was tabled at the Ontario legislature, and Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Education, gave a very terse response that basically said, no, we're pretty happy with the education system as it stands. We're not going to be changing it. So how would you like to see this change come to Canada? Come to Canada, and specifically to Ontario. And for our listeners who, having heard all of this, are no doubt now motivated to see that change happen in this province and in this country, what actions would you recommend? How would you like to see the change come about? And what actions would you recommend for people who want to help make it happen?
I mean, my preference would be to be done politically, where the politics of, if you look at the polls of all the major parties in Ontario, they all, when they disaggregate the totals, they all support amalgamation. So one of these years, one of those political parties will hopefully make it part of their platform and implement change. If not, I'd like to see it pursued in the courts. But I think the ideal way would be to do it through politics. So what would I like to see? I mean, what can the ordinary individual do? Well, obviously, there's getting involved in a political party and let your opinions be known. Speak to people about the topic and why it's important, why it needs to get done. If you're a teacher and you're get involved in your union, because they're in a unique position, I think, to affect change. It affects their lives in their profession, much more so than it would for even me as a non-teacher. So yeah, those are like, I would say, obvious things that come to mind anyway.
All right. Well, Greg, this has been a great conversation. I've learned a few things myself, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. I will put a link to the Secular Alliance in the show notes so that people can take a look at the website and join the organization if they wish. Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts you have for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I forgot to give a shout out. There is an organization that has recently become active that is called Alumni to Amend Section 93 Ontario, and they've got a webpage. So Google that. I would encourage people to do. Other than that, yeah, it's like any issue in politics. Sometimes progress can be slow, but ultimately anybody who, I think, values what are core to every liberal democracy, the idea of treating everybody equally, that nobody gets a special privilege, that we're all kind of equal value. I'm optimistic that in the long run this will eventually change.
All right. Greg Oliver, president and founder of the Canadian Secular Alliance, thank you for talking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
It was my pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.